Okay, we're alive. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pogward broadcast. Long time no see. Uh, we decided to open this episode is because Hong Kong uh, issued granted its first licenses for stable coins, which is huge for the whole crypto industry and for the traditional finance ecosystem and the international uh, uh, environment. So that's why we believe that it worth us to dive into this topic. So that's why we invite Max uh, to explore the detail of this topic together. Welcome, Max.
Hello, Kristen. Always good to be here.
Okay, let's start with the latest development. Hong Kong has issued its first stablecoin licenses on April 10. The two banks are HSBC and the Standard Chartered Bank. They are chosen from 36 applicants and including other huge and influential institutions. So what actually changes because of this?
Yeah, so I mean, this is like a trend that we've been exploring or that we've been following for a long time.
Mhm.
Um, as a matter of fact, we've also been trying to get Polkadot more actively involved in the Hong Kong dollar stablecoin rails as an infrastructure play. Um,
Mhm.
these conversations are currently being put on hold, let's say, because there isn't really anyone from the foundation side who's actively pursuing that or dedicating resources to that. So I guess Polkadot is now more in an observer position, which might well be fine. Polkadot may still enter this race a little bit later on.
Mhm.
That's fine for me. But I'm obviously personally quite interested in this space as well because I live in Hong Kong and I know a lot of the regulators and like the people who are working in this space. And so the recent issuing of stablecoin licenses is, of course, a big milestone in Hong Kong. So let me quickly summarize it. So there are kind of two events. Like last year in summer, I think it was like August or so last year, the HKMA issued its stablecoin ordinance, which is like the legal framework which allows uh, regulated entities in Hong Kong to come out and apply for licenses to issue and distribute their own stablecoins, right?
Mhm.
So that's about a year ago now. And back then there was a lot of hype. It was also like following a long period of public consultation, and then they came up with this framework, right? And then there was the sandbox, right? Which
Mhm.
isn't really the sandbox isn't really like it by definition it's a closed trial. It's not accessible to the public. So for that, we had like a number of different consortiums, both from Hong Kong and from mainland China, who here in Hong Kong did experiment around with that and provide their findings back to the HKMA. And then there's kind of the third step, and that's kind of why we're talking about this now, because just a few days ago, I think, uh, what's the date, 10th of April or something like that, yeah, just about a week ago or so, a bit more, it was announced that the HKMA had issued the first two actual licenses, right? And there was quite a bit of surprise to me and also to, I guess, a bunch of other observers that followed that space who received them because um, it ended up going to two big banks, right? And two very well established banks in Hong Kong,
Mhm.
um, HSBC and Standard Chartered. Um, to be a bit more specific for Standard Chartered, it didn't actually go to Standard Chartered, but to a consortium or like a joint venture between Standard Chartered and Imoca Brands, which is a
Mhm.
crypto native uh, project here in Hong Kong, and like a local telecom provider. Um, HSBC, on the other hand, was purely the bank that received the license. And why am I saying this was a bit of a surprise? Well, one thing is because HSBC has been really lying low, so they didn't really like talk very much about it. About Standard Chartered and Animoca, we've been like we were well aware that they're applying for it, and that they're in the process of going there. They were also in the sandbox. I think that's the important part, right? Um, and so it was very well publicized. We also knew the Standard Chartered guys personally who were working on this, and so no surprise there. HSBC is obviously like a very much like established bank in Hong Kong and globally as well. But you know, I mean, the name is literally Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, right? So here in Hong Kong, it has a very long tradition. And to see these kind of guys like going into the space is, of course, really exciting, right? Because this is like
Mhm.
very much like a mainstay, like sort of Main Street type of financial institution. It's a very long history that is now, that successfully received its license, and yeah, so we're quite excited to see what happens there. One last sentence about who got these licenses. So in the sandbox, there were also a couple of like Chinese players, right?
Mhm.
So there was like sort of a subsidiary of uh, Ant Financial. There was like JD, like a JD Jingdong affiliate. There were a few other like Chinese, like mainland Chinese sort of payment service providers, right, or affiliates of those in Hong Kong who also had applied for the license and who then, at the end of the day, did not get the license, right? Or
Mhm.
some of
Mhm.
them, my understanding is they also withdrew it before the final decision was made. But
Mhm.
it's still pretty interesting because you know these the guys who actually got it at the end of the day are very much like Hong Kong institutions and not like mainland Chinese institutions. And I think this also kind of sends a bit of a message in terms of like where the priorities of the HKMA lie here.
Yeah, I hear you say what a milestone it is for Hong Kong and what a surprise for you. And let's get a bit more concrete on regulation. Now, Hong Kong's framework requires full licensing, 100% reserves, and bank level compliance. So, in practical terms, that mean USDT or USDC simply cannot operate in Hong Kong?
Yeah, that's half true, I would say. It's not that they cannot operate at all. Um, they can um, on local exchanges, on locally regulated exchanges, they can only be used for professional investors. Like
Mhm.
that's kind of the difference here. You're right about retail investors, right? So retail investors on local exchanges are not allowed to use USDT, USDC, right? And I mean, I kind of know this from personal experience. So, for example, the largest, most well-known exchange that is locally regulated is Hashkey, right? Hashkey Exchange. They have like a local Hong Kong license. And for retail investors, yes, absolutely, you cannot deposit USDT, USDC. You cannot
Mm,
receive it. You cannot send it, um, unless you're an institutional investor. Right? Then you can do it.
mm,
Um, I guess the whole point of this is to promote the HKD stablecoin, right? Because I mean it's not live yet, but we expect it to go live like towards the end of this year, and then um, these kind of guys, they will be allowed to trade on the locally regulated exchanges, right? And it obviously is going to give them an advantage, right? So there is a clear like by putting the framework the way it is, of course, they're trying to give the local champion, so to speak, an advantage. Otherwise, it's very tough to compete against USDC, USDT. But yeah, that way, people who don't want to go through professional investor certification, they are essentially going to end up using the HKD stablecoin. So that is, I believe, very much the purpose of this designation.
Do you believe that are we moving toward a system that dominated by bank issued stablecoin and stablecoin native uh, crypto native stablecoins are looking at being excluded or
Yeah,
yeah. Mhm.
yeah. I mean, it's possible, right? It's
Mhm.
possible. I mean, the Hong Kong legislation definitely points in this direction. I mean, I also want to say that the US regulation is very different, right? Um, I mean, I guess like in the US, the thing to watch here is the Clarity Act, right? Whether that gets passed in its current form. If so, for example, there is like a way for banks, or well, no, not for banks, for stablecoin issuers to also pay yield on the people who are holding the stablecoins, and that would be quite a game changer because then they're really going for the main business of banks, right? They're basically
Mhm.
undercutting their just being better banks. Um, and then the question is whether banks want to allow that, which
Mhm.
you know is obviously a very heated debate already. In Hong Kong, right, that particular part, you know, like paying interest is not a possibility. It's not an option, right? Like on this Hong Kong dollar stablecoin, there is no like interest bearing instrument on it um,
Mhm.
at the moment, right? That's kind of how they're designed. So they're just like one-to-one backed, right? But there's no facility for earning interest or yield. I guess that's probably also like one of the compromises that the
Mhm.
HKMA decided to make with the banks. Um, yeah, no, sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
Yeah, let's, explore more on this direction. Can we say that Hong Kong is building a Web3 ecosystem or simply bringing stablecoins bank under the traditional financial system?
yeah, that's a great question. I think, I mean, it's obviously merging. I think that's really it, right? I think in the future, maybe my big picture prediction, like let's say in 5 years, in 10 years from now, uh, there isn't going to be a real difference between DeFi and TradFi anymore. These things are going to be by and large the same thing, and
Mm-hmm.
it kind of goes into both directions, right? I guess one thing is that like TradFi institutions start to use public ledgers, public blockchains to issue, trade, and transfer digital representation of value, right, of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then on the other hand side, like sort of the current what we call DeFi today, right, like everything around like Aave, for example, for lending, borrowing, or for yield generation, like and Uniswap for trading, like these kind of things, they are gonna get like more and more sort of professionalized as well, right? Where like other, more traditional players start offering these kind of services, and you know, it may well be like a good thing because some of the exploits that we've seen recently, right? Through better audits, through more rigorous regulations, are hopefully not going to happen again. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously, these two things are going to merge, right? Um, I think that's sort of inevitable, and generally, I think it's like a, a positive trend, right? Um, where it starts getting like kind of interesting, right, or a little bit dicey, is around the question of KYC AML, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously this used to be limited to like the regulated like high street banks that they were doing that, and by and large in crypto you could get around that, right? And you could buy and sell stable coins in a sort of non KYC manner.
Mm-hmm.
That is likely going to be increasingly difficult, right? At the Hong Kong HKMA uh, stablecoin ordinance makes it very clear, right? So if you wanna like off ramp Hong Kong dollar stablecoins into fiat, not even that actually, also just to send and receive Hong Kong dollar stablecoins, right, through like the HSBC apps, for example, like the PayMe app here in Hong Kong, right? That's going to be a wallet, use to transition into a wallet for stablecoins. For that, you will have to be fully KYC. Right? That's very clear. There is no question around that. Like they're not going
Mhm,
to allow anonymous
mhm.
ownership, or not anonymous, but pseudonymous ownership of um, these coins, right? These Hong Kong dollar stable coins. So this will be like a fully KYC and probably like automated AML
Mhm.
compliant system. So that's for sure. And there are obviously like pros and cons that we can talk about here, right? About like a fully KYC chain, but that is very much the direction into which this piece of legislation is going.
Yeah, KYC and AML, I think will put some threshold for the users. Um, some people are arguing that the Hong Kong uh, uh, stablecoin regulation are competing with US ones because both of them are going to, you know, trying to take the domination uh, of the the dollars, the money that backed in their financial ecosystems. So in your opinion, which system is more likely to scale globally, a tightly regulated model like Hong Kong's, or market driven one like the United States?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. One thing I always like to say is the Hong Kong dollar is actually the world's most successful stablecoin, right? And
Wow.
that's already been, way before we got into crypto and blockchain. The Hong Kong dollar has always been pegged to the US dollar. I think 7.2, 7.21, something like that. So it's always been pegged to the US dollar. And it's been one of the most successful, I think, actually the most successful peg of any currency pair ever, right? So it's kind of a stable coin pegged to the dollar, right? That's of course a part of the special history of Hong Kong being inside China, but you know open to the international financial system, and therefore it's very important that the local currency is pegged to the US dollar and doesn't fluctuate like I don't know the yen or something fluctuates to the US dollar. Um, but in that sense, you can argue that Hong Kong already has like a lot of experience with maintaining a peg, right? And the HKMA, there's also licensing these new stable coins, right? They have been a very successful steward of this peg, right? Maintaining the peg essentially since the inception of the Hong Kong dollar, with some very short exceptions. Um, so, I guess that's one claim to fame here in Hong Kong already, and maybe the HKMA can use that experience in terms of like stable coins as well, like sort of crypto stable coins as well. But I think your question is something slightly different here, right? Like whether like the more closed or the more open system will win, and it's probably too early to tell. Currently, like both systems are being pursued. I mean, what the US has made pretty clear now is that, and that's part of the Clarity Act, but also like very much a consensus, including from coming from President Trump himself, is that the US is not interested in issuing a central bank digital currency like CBDC. Uh, because that like a few years ago, that was kind of all the hype. Right? Are the central banks, right? Is the Fed at some point going to issue their own stablecoins? So they made it pretty clear that they're not going to do that, and I'm quite happy about that because that would be, the path to, ultimate surveillance and programmed money and like money that you can only spend for certain things and so on and so on. So, um, So this is pretty clear now that this is not going to happen. I think more likely, and that in that sense, like the U.S. and Hong Kong is similar again, right? Is that you have a situation where the regulator, right, HMA or SEC, SEC, are gonna go out and say, okay, this is like a rule book, right? That's how licensed institutions and banks can go and issue their own stable coins, right? Fully, full reserve, probably like there was the ML. That's but the issuer is not going to be the government itself, right? Or not, I mean, the central bank itself, but commercial banks, right? And in that sense, it's kind of the same situation, right? I mean, HSBC is still a commercial bank and Standard Chartered as well. Um, and I think that's actually quite a reasonable approach in many ways because it still fosters competition, right? There's not like one single issuer. All the issuers have to play by the rules, but there's not just one single issuer, and you know that's a good thing. In the US, probably yes, you have Circle, you have Tether, and then I wouldn't be surprised if some other like well-known banks, I don't know, JP Morgan, for example, jump in there as well and start issuing their own stablecoins in the future, right? After the Clarity Act is passed, that's possible, right?
Mhm.
But you know, it's good because it creates some sort of competition, and that's usually welcome, right? In terms of for the users. And then one other thought that I just came to mind now. Hong Kong is actually pretty unique in many ways. Like prior, like in the old system, in the fiat system, forget about blockchain for a moment, right? Is that also the Hong Kong dollar is not issued by the central bank, but by commercial banks.
Ah.
Yeah. So if you come to Hong Kong and you just go to, look at the paper bills, you will find like uh, the notes, the bills, where it says issued by Standard Chartered, right? And you will find other notes that says issued by HSBC, right? So,
Mm.
and a few others. So it's actually the commercial banks that are issuing the banknotes, right? It's very different to, for example, well, I mean, pretty much anywhere else, right? Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, you name it, right? There it's always like the central bank who are issuing the banknotes, like the physically banknotes, right?
Mhm.
Hong Kong is the commercial banks, but other under regulation of the HKMA. So that's a rather unique kind of position. And in the US, like a little history lesson, it used to be like that as well up until I don't remember the year, but like in the past, like 100 years ago, let's say, it was also like commercial banks that issued banknotes, right?
Mhm.
Um, so nowadays nobody heard of those banks anymore because many are gone. Well, maybe I don't know, maybe Wells Fargo. I think they were like one of the earlier ones, right? They, as a commercial bank, issued U.S. dollars, right? And that was perfectly fine, right? Because that was still under the gold standard. Because then, like these banknotes would be redeemable for like a bar of gold, right? And as long as the bank issues those notes and takes it back against gold, it's perfectly fine, right? Only after, well, I guess it's 71, right? Under Nixon, when the U.S. went away, like from the gold standard, right? And then the Fed started issuing their own banknotes, right? Then the commercial banks were no longer allowed to issue their own banknotes, but only the Fed was. But in Hong Kong, as I said, this principle actually continues up until now.
Mm. Yeah, it's good to know. Yeah, it's hard to. Now it's too early to say that which gonna win the market, and also there's more factors have to considering in, and there are also the market is evolving, and also the January Act, even though they are being proved, but it needs more time to take action. So
Mm.
let's go and see. Um, and finally, let's wrap up our conversation back to Polkadot ecosystem.
Mhm.
So, in the current eco environment, where do you see the opportunities for Polkadot?
Yeah, I mean, since we're talking about stablecoins, let's keep on that topic for a little bit. Um, Look, I think Polkadot would be incredibly well suited as a settlement layer for stablecoins.
Mm,
Incredibly well suited. Super fast transactions, super low fees. Um, it's composable. It has like great, cross-chain infrastructure. You can put the reserve asset to, you know, the actual dollar coin, so that you don't need to hold dot for transaction fees. Um, in many ways, it's like better, more well suited than Ethereum, and definitely it's more well suited than some of the L2s, right? Like Arbitrum,
mm,
for example. I mean, actually, let me just take a little bit of an excursion here, right? So, when we had like the recent Kelp DAO hack, and then the hacker moved like some funds to Arbitrum, right? Arbitrum just decided to freeze them, right?
mm,
So it really goes to show that um, something like Arbitrum is not decentralized. Like if something happens, right, they can just go and like, yeah, okay, sorry, money is gone, right? We freeze it. I mean,
mm,
of course, I understand why they're doing it, and of course, I understand that they want to freeze those hacked funds, but it just very clearly shows that this is not a decentralized network. Polkadot in itself still is, right? On Polkadot, something like that could not happen. Now, you can argue whether this is good or bad, right? But it's just like a statement about arbitration. Also, to double click on this particular question, there is, in my opinion, a difference if a freeze of assets is done by the network or by the
mm,
stablecoin issuer, right? That's not the same thing. In Arbitrum's case, right, it was actually done by Arbitrum because, well, okay, I think we're all talking about ETH here in that case. But anyways, but it's the network that is that is doing the freezing. If uh, if a stablecoin issuer, such as Tether, is doing the freezing, that's a very different story.
mm,
Um, and the reason why it's a different story is because the stablecoin issuer is very clearly under a legal obligation to do so, right? They can just like, and Tether is, I mean, that's well known, right? Like Tether has been like freezing all kind of like hacked coins or like stolen coins in the past, right? With a court order. They've been doing that like many, many times. Um, so, and I think it makes more sense, right, in terms of system design, that if we want to have a way of like covering stolen or hacked funds, that it happens on the level of the stablecoin issuer and not of the network. And so if you talk about if you agree with that kind of notion, then Polkadot is very well suited because it's a decentralized permissionless network on which you could issue stable coins. But then if, for example, the freezing of coins is still a regulatory requirement, which frankly speaking will be pretty much anywhere, right? Uh, in an effort to combat money laundering, terrorist financing, and you know cyber criminality in general, um, then you can still also on Polkadot implement like a system where like the issuer can freeze those assets, let's say, and
mm,
you can put the whole like compliance handbook there, and you can you can say under which circumstances that is the case. And most likely it should be with under the direction of law enforcement, right? It shouldn't be like a council that sits somewhere and says, "Oh, this we're gonna freeze, this we're not gonna freeze." But there can be like a general direction that these law enforcement agencies have the right to issue an order to you know to freeze coins that are proven to have been stolen or hacked. Right?
Mhm.
That's a reasonable system, right? Um, it's not. It's obviously not like the original cypherpunk ideal where like anyone can do anything, but we're not really living in this world anymore, right? Regulation is real, does exist, right? Law enforcement does exist, and they have their claims where or they have actions that they need to pursue, and like a system can be designed that is very much compliant to that. And so that's kind of a long way of saying that Polkadot is generally speaking well suited as a settlement layer for stablecoins, including the current ones, USDT, USDC, as well as future ones, such as
Mhm.
like the Hong Kong dollar stablecoin. But unfortunately, as per my understanding, currently there isn't really like any, you know, initiative by the foundation or by Parity to pursue these opportunities.
Mhm.
Maybe that will change in the future, but currently it's not happening because keep in mind at the end of the day it's a competitive market, and of course the likes of Solana,
Mhm.
um, Ethereum itself, right, Tron, right, they're all going after these markets, right? These are very very big, very very lucrative markets, and of course these other ecosystems or Sui, for example, but many more, right? Obviously, each of them they are very actively pursuing these markets. They're trying to get into these markets,
Mhm.
and maybe they're just better at business development vis-a-vis, you know,
Mhm.
uh, the regulators, vis-a-vis the commercial banks that are the issuers of these coins than Polkadot at the moment.
Yeah, there's consensus that stablecoin or RWA might be the uh, the best use cases for blockchains. And yeah, it is true that Polkadot gonna be a good settlement layer for stable coins. And I agree with you. There need to be an initiative to make this happen. And we really hope that Polkadot can, take this opportunity soon. Okay. Thank you, Max. And I hope that for this episode, uh, uh, audience can learn more information about Hong Kong regulation and the position we are in the global financial world. I think Max gave us a very detailed and informative explanation. Really hope that this episode could help help our audience to know more about that. So, thank you, Max, for sharing, and thank you, all the audience for watching. And that's all for today.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you, Kristen. Always
Mhm.
nice to be here on the podcast, and yeah, speak soon
Mhm.
again.
Bye bye.
All right. Cheers, everyone.
Mhm. Okay.